started. This is the Keizer Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, October 10th. Everybody's here, that's supposed to be here. Okay. Can we move to the swearing in of our new commissioner, or should we defer that since Shannon's not here yet? I can move. Let's move.
As long as we don't vote on anything, I can sit here as long as you need me to.
Let's go ahead, and do we have enough to approve of the minutes from the
Motion to approve.
September?
As her said.
Okay, these are the minutes of the September 2018 meeting. I have a motion to approve and a second. All those in favor say aye.
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 I abstain since I was not here at that meeting. Okay.
All right, so I'll swear.
I'm gonna say, I can't vote and you don't have enough.
Okay, you want to skip down to that? Okay, sure.
The next item on our agenda is appearance of interested citizens. This is the time that is made available for those who wish to speak about an issue that is not on the commission's agenda tonight. It appears that there is no one here tonight for this particular item. Nobody signed up, so we will move on. The next area is a public hearing on the proposed text amendments, sections 1.200 and 2.403, modifying standards for accessory dwelling units.
Why don't we skip ahead and I can do new and old business, so we can talk a little bit about what's going on in the grants and
Since I did not hit the gavel, the public hearing on that is not open yet.
we are off the rails.
So we will hold the public hearing a little later and move right to a new old business and staff report.
Well, as you know, we have our upcoming meeting on the 22nd. We would like to talk to you about exactly how, our scheduling. So it is not, right now it is not advertised as a joint meeting, so it is not mandatory that the Planning Commission be there. But it would be very helpful if the Planning Commission was there to hear the presentation of the materials. We were just on a phone call today going through the material with our consultant. That's Glenn Boland from OTAC. And so we pointed out that a couple of things that we thought would strengthen the report, including an executive summary, kind of give a more solid conclusion as to implications for the city of Keizer, those kinds of things. So he is going to be working on that this coming week, and we expect to send that out to you all by next week. So we are gearing up for that meeting on Monday the 22nd. Will all of you be able to be there at that meeting?
So, Mr. Chair, so I have a question, because we have two items going on right now, the transportation portion and then the River Road. Is this both? Was this one?
No, this is just the education outreach presentation of the final report.
Okay, understood.
Okay.
So we also had an additional phone call with the land use consultants portion of the revitalization grant today, and we were walking through each of their proposed action items as far as toolkits of things that the city could implement to recognize more efficiency in our zoning. So we were working to refine that, had some good discussions on that. The revitalization grant program is going to be a longer project. This one on the education outreach is as you know, pretty discreet, and this will be the final report and the final presentation. It's not expected that there will be any action item. The council is not required to adopt it. So we will kind of play that by ear as to what the council, and if you have any thoughts, by all means, share those for that process. Today, I finally hit the send button on the Federal Rail Administration Consolidated Rail Infrastructure Improvement Program request to create a quiet crossing at Shamawa. May I never submit another federal grant?
They're fun.
And it wasn't, I mean, the people were very helpful. Every time I had a phone call, it was, and don't get me wrong, they were amazingly helpful and understanding, even though that grant program is intended for major infrastructure construction, safety improvements. And this itty bitty little grant that we're submitting is kind of completely out of their wheelhouse. So, but anyway, it is submitted now, and so we play the wait and see game. So we'll see. The prognostication is very minimal, however, as far as the likelihood of this grant. But it has been a good exercise, and it's, as I told Councillor Freeman, somebody's got to win the lottery, so we'll see. And so with that, I think maybe Debbie, if you would, if we can go to that point. The reason is, Councillor Collier needs to be,
Yeah, for the hearing portion.
Commissioner Collier. Okay.
Okay, the two
Yeah,
need to stand.
stand up.
Raise your right hand, please. Repeat after me. I, Mark Collier,
I, Mark Keizer,
being first duly sworn,
being first duly sworn,
upon oath say
upon oath say,
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of Oregon,
and the Constitution of the State of Oregon,
and that I will faithfully and impartially discharge the duties
and I will faithfully and impartially discharge the duties
of a planning commissioner for the city of Keizer,
of a planning commissioner for the city of Keizer,
according to the best of my ability,
according to the best of my ability,
for my term of office.
for my term of office.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
For our viewing public, and Crystal, I think you don't know Mark. Mark, could you kind of give an introduction on where you've been and everything here in Keizer?
Are we trying to get out of here by 9, right?
Well, I was down at Keizer Rapids Park this afternoon at the Arboretum putting in irrigation with Randy Miller.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean greater sense. I've served on the city council. I've been assigned to the planning commission in the past. I've served on a number of committees, a number of projects. Had a great time, great opportunity to live in Keizer, and we've been here since 1978.
Yeah. Our kids played football together at McNary, and Mark was a Salem police officer.
Yep.
Thank you, Mark.
You bet.
And congratulations, and this is a fun committee, really.
You know, I was assigned to this as a counselor, and that's not the perspective I had at the time, but
Well-
I appreciate that things change. This is a
And I'm on
this is
medication.
a hard-working committee, and it's a very detailed committee. And as a city councilor, you always appreciated the work, the detailed work that comes out of the planning commission.
There's a lot of reading and use of, at least for me, a magnifying glass to read some stuff. So, yeah. With that, we are going back to item number 5, the public hearing, again, on proposed text amendments for sections 1.200 and 2.403. The hearing is open. Staff?
All right, well, thank you. So tonight we have 2 sections of the development code that we are proposing some changes to. Section 2.403 and 1.2. They are, timing is amazing. So they are for accessory dwelling units. Previously, we have allowed, since actually the inception of the current development code, when it was adopted in 1998, we've always allowed accessory residential housing units. but there was some legislation passed this past year that created some requirements for cities of our size to allow for what they term accessory dwelling units. And as the staff report kind of pointed out, we already were compliant with the laws that were passed, but lots of other jurisdictions around the state had to create rules. We looked at our rules and kind of made the determination that we were good to go, but the state also published some guidance materials and a model code, and we felt it was appropriate to kind of look at their stuff, and we've gotten a lot more calls and a lot more inquiries in the past 6 to 8 months about accessory dwelling units. And so one of the primary things we wanted to do was align the terminology we use with what's found in the legislation, which is the term accessory dwelling unit, or affectionately referred to as an ADU. In doing that, we did look, and I sent you, basically there was a handout that was produced by DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development folks, that basically gave some guidance on what they thought cities should do to address housing needs and housing options in towns. They also provided some model code language, which was extremely short, like 1 page of that document was the model code. And then we also provided just the staff recommendation and then really some staff notes that we had made. In addressing some of the questions at the counter and over the phone, we realized that some of our standards, there was some ambiguity in them and some confusion in certain scenarios. So what we have before you, we're trying to address those issues we've seen. And so what I'd like to do tonight is kind of walk through the kind of my staff notes paper with you, because it kind of spells out what DLCD was recommending and kind of our response to it. And then we can get into, you can wordsmith away on the actual section. Just real quick, the definition section of the code, the only change we're proposing is to change the term that we used to use of accessory residential housing to now a ADU. So that's all we're doing. So we're calling it an accessory dwelling. That definition's pulled from the state. The substance, though, is in 2.403, where we change some stuff around and we do make some changes. So with that state guidance document, one of the things that they addressed were the number of units. The bill required that cities allowed at least 1 ADU in conjunction with a single family dwelling. And we're sticking to that. That's what we've allowed in the past. The DLCD guidance materials really strongly encouraged folks to allow 2 ADUs, both an attached dwelling unit and a detached. We did not feel that we had a broken, standard currently, and didn't necessarily feel it was necessary or desirable to add an additional unit. So we're continuing to propose just 1 additional unit in addition to your single family home, whether or not it's inside the structure as a floor conversion or a attached apartment, or if it's a separate kind of classic mother-in-law type cottage that everybody kind of knows. The siding standards, big part of the bill was to remove barriers to these types of developments. And so they talked about different things from size, conversion, lots of different things that you could do. And for us, kind of the substance for us, we've had a standard since 2015 to allow an ADU up to 750 square feet. And we're not proposing to change that. We've actually had a few come in, and we've had a couple of pretty nice little units at 750 square feet, a couple of good floor plans with 2 bedrooms, living area, bath, kitchen, all of that. And we feel that going much larger than that, it can come into a bit of a dominant visual aspect. The state's recommendation was to allow 800 to 900 square feet, or possibly a percentage. City of Salem, when they adopted their standards, they're allowing up to 900 square feet, but it's also capped at a percentage of 75% of the main house. We're proposing to keep it at the 750, but we have no percentage connection. So you could have a main house of 800 square feet and an ADU of 750 square feet. We like it from an administrative perspective because we don't have to look into tax records or argue about how large someone's houses is from square footage, or if they say, well, that's not accurate because we did this addition and it wasn't accounted for. We can just look at plans and go, it's 750 square feet. Easy. So that's what we're proposing. The other thing we're doing that's new in that area was the setbacks that we currently had for a detached ADU were 10 feet for a rear yard setback and 5 feet for a side. We're proposing to lower that setback down to 5 feet for a rear yard setback for a 1-story ADU. But if somebody were building a 2-story ADU, we are requiring them or proposing to require them to maintain that 10-foot setback. Previously, we didn't differentiate. Some places have gone down lower than that, like down to 3 feet. We are having a provision in there that if a structure is closer than 3 feet, that they'll need to provide some sort of a maintenance agreement so they can maintain the side of the home. And that kind of leads one of the other big things we're clarifying that we didn't have clearly denoted in our code previously, and that's what about the case where I have a existing accessory building that was maybe originally built as a shop, and now I want to come in and I want to convert it to an ADU. How do I do that? Can I do that? And we actually had 3 or 4 folks who could not do that based on the setback standards. And so they had accessory buildings, which historically have been regulated based on wall height. And so they might be only 3 feet off a property line or even 2 feet off a property line. And so we had a couple folks come in existing neighborhoods and they wanted to convert an existing accessory building, and they weren't able to do that. One, their buildings, some of them were too large because they were accessory buildings that were built in times when we didn't have limits to accessory structure sizes, or they were too close to property lines. And so what we're proposing to do is to allow, regardless, and this matches up with the kind of the guidance material, we're proposing to allow, regardless of its location, an accessory building that's there and that was legally established, you can convert that to an ADU with the caveat that we're still going to cap it at 750 square feet. So if they have a 1,500 square foot shop building and you want to convert half of it to an ADU and keep the other half as a shop, we're proposing that that would be what we would allow them to do. Design standards were talked about quite a bit in the document, and they said you shouldn't have terms like compatible or similar or characteristic, other than maybe in historic districts. We are proposing, because we had some of that language that's a bit ambiguous, and somebody could look at it and go, well, I think this is similar to that residence, and this person says, no, it's not, and where does it begin and end? So what we're proposing is tying it directly to single-family design standards. So for a detached ADU, for a new single-family home, we have a provision that says, hey, when you build a new single-family home, you got to use at least 5 of these features, things like eaves and covered porches and different materials and a certain amount of windows to kind of create, basically so somebody's not throwing up a giant blank box. So what we're proposing is that with the ADU, because it's much smaller in scale, we're proposing that folks would be required to provide 3 of those same features that a regular single-family home would be able to provide, which would basically make it very clear for an applicant coming in that can look at a standard and go, okay, my ADU needs to look like this. So that's for that piece. Parking, DLCD recommended that you require no additional parking for ADUs. They viewed it as a barrier. Actually made kind of a good argument in the case where if a driveway was widened, a curb cut would go from this large to that large and take away on-street parking anyway, so you'd have kind of an affected no net gain. As staff, we felt like that argument actually was pretty legitimate. Previously, we required 1 additional parking space for an ADU, regardless of which, and actually there was a few folks that kind of got turned away because they had no ability to widen a driveway or provide an additional parking space on site. So what we're proposing is that if there is no on-street parking available, then they have to provide a space. But if on-street parking is available, then we're not proposing to provide 1 additional space at that point in time. So that one is a change to what we've had in the past. And then owner occupancy, we've always required owner occupancy in the attached type of ADU, where you convert part of your home to another dwelling unit for someone to live in. We didn't clearly require it in the detached ADU. I think it was kind of assumed, but it wasn't clearly there. So we actually are adding that and saying, regardless of what type of ADU it is, we want to see an owner occupancy requirement as staff. We actually had some good heated discussions about that. DLCD kind of argued that you shouldn't do it because it's hard to regulate. And we kind of looked at it, and there was a compelling argument made that, a piece of that is there is a difference when you have an owner occupied property. The investment that's into that is a little different than just multiple rental units, and it also gives the ability, if you have issues, there's somebody there who you can make contact with. So we're proposing to keep the owner occupied piece in the code and clearly add it to the detached ADU so it's fair on both sides of the court. And then the last two things that were identified in the DLCD stuff was public utilities provisions and SDC provisions. And there's nothing in the text amendments that address those specifically, because they're handled through different courses of action. I mean, essentially the utility, that's handled through the Public Works Department. Generally speaking, our standard is that you get one water meter per lot. So with an ADU, they're not going to get additional water services or sewer services. It's going to hook into the existing that are there, or that be extended. But that being said, it wouldn't expressly prohibit them from being able to do that if the service provider was willing to allow that. So we didn't address that in this. And then the SDCs aren't specifically addressed in the text. That will be a discussion that has to kind of be worked out a little bit further. We have kind of looked at our existing SDC methodology, and it has been determined that we can charge SDCs for an ADU because it is defined as a dwelling unit. I mean, that's what it is. However, most cities around the state who've adopted standards and are applying SDC methodologies, they don't apply the same level of requirement on an ADU that they would a primary single-family dwelling. And we've kind of done an initial analysis, and we're looking to propose that we would charge the same kind of SDC as you to charge a apartment unit. That's what Salem did. It's what Bend does. It's what quite a few other cities have chose to do. So that kind of boils down the categories of discussion. And with that, I would kind of turn it back to you guys and open it up to any questions you have on the actual text in 2.403. If there's any clarifications we can make, or if you have just, what were you guys thinking here? I'd be happy to entertain those questions.
One question I have is related to the owner occupancy. There in your notes, it mentions to prevent many multifamily. That confuses me. Isn't that what kind of we wanting as a community? Is families living together, or
Dogs and cats living together.
well, yeah, I know. I'm just asking that question. It's not-
I think, Hirsch, the term just, again, that was not technical terms, that was just like Shane notes. When I use the term multifamily, I mean like apartment complexes.
Okay.
So higher density.
Okay.
So really for that, it probably would make more sense to say, look at overall density. And the reason is there's kind of an expectation with overall zoning that says, hey, if I'm buying a home or a property that's in a zone that's all surrounded by residential single-family zoned properties, and the primary use of that is for detached single-family dwellings, there's not an expectation that you're next to a fourplex or a fiveplex or a sixplex or something like that. So that was, that's kind of what I meant by that term.
Thinking of the scenario, well, okay, we can't do it with our new house, but maybe with the old house, we could have put an ADU.
Sure.
Maybe my daughter that's a teacher move in there.
Right.
So
No,
Okay.
and we definitely, that's, I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I think that ADUs are a little more popular. One, market pressure, but also there is that piece of familial expansion and being able to all be in one place. So we definitely are not anti that.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to clarify that one. Mark?
I'm the new guy, I was gonna wait.
Okay.
So, and maybe I'm confused now. 2.403.1 sub D, occupancy, only one of the two dwelling units may be occupied by a family which does not include an owner occupant of the building. So everything that you just said doesn't seem like it jives with this part, unless I'm completely misunderstanding how I'm reading this.
I think it does, it's just that you're saying it one way and Shane said it another one.
Right, but Shane just
Half
said,
of the one house has to be occupied by the owner. The second unit may be occupied by a family member or
Anybody.
a traditional tenant.
Yeah.
Isn't that what you're saying, Shane?
Yes.
Yeah, kind of like my
Absolutely.
example of using my daughter in that house. I own that. Yeah.
well, okay, so then it goes back to which I kind of understood, but then it goes back to that the ADU must be owner occupied, is something you said when you were discussing the staff report.
So I understand what you're saying. Yes. So the text that is proposed, and let me rephrase. Speaking in generalities is a little difficult.
Sure.
Trying to just explain the concept. I don't care if you live in the ADU or you live in the main house. And remember, there's both attached ADUs and detached ADUs. So when you're dealing with an attached ADU, it really functions a little more like a duplex. So how can you determine which one is which? The standard that we're saying is that any property that has an ADU on it, the owner of that property has to live there.
In one of
The
them.
property specifically.
On the
Yes.
property.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's what the language reflects, Matt.
So they could live either in the ADU
Yep.
or on the main,
Absolutely. Or in the main house.
okay.
Yep. Or you could convert your basement and it's smaller and move down in the basement and rent out the main house to somebody.
The property issue, not the dwelling itself.
Correct.
Thank you for the clarification.
You bet.
I have a comment and a couple of questions.
Be sure to
One-
pull the mic close.
Thank you. One is under the Public Utilities and Systems Development Charges.
Sorry.
Here we go.
I'm just shy, Shannon.
I know.
Anyhow, in the Public Utilities and the Systems Development Charges, I know that that's something that needs to be worked out collaboratively between planning and public works and all, but in order to make a recommendation towards this, it would be nice to have some, what are we really gonna be doing here? So that we have clarity on, is it a full new SDC? Is it prorated like it would be if you're building 20 units? Just so we have more of a defined number. The other, let's see, one of the other ones, the design standards, I think that's great to keep them meeting at least three of the elements that we have currently. And I started to talk with Nate and Shane before we started the building. And this deals with a property that already has a duplex on it. We have a number of those. They're corner lots in Keizer. Most of them, because of the current way they've been developed, probably does not going to lend itself to an ADU. But there's some that do. And I've driven around the neighborhoods to different parts where there's a number of duplexes. And there's a few where you could add an ADU to a duplex. But in the code that Matt referenced, 403, I think it is, it says that basically you can only have two in an RS lot, which is or an RS zone where most of these duplexes occur. But if you have a duplex on a corner lot, but the footprint allows it to realistically meet all the other standards, but then you have the occupancy that can only be 50%. I think we should consider, because I think part of the goal here is to increase housing, not just for our immediate family, but to expand potential rental properties for people, that if you have this situation on a duplex, that then you're only going to have 1 out of 3 potentially is going to be, there's going to be 1 owner and 2 non-family in the other 2 units. And I think that's worth considering if we're going to try to not cannibalize more land and increase housing density. I think this is one way that we should consider doing. And the another part of that deals with the parking, where in several of these duplexes I looked at that may potentially have the ability to have, you've got the traditional fronts are, say they're on Shamawa Road, and but to get that ADU unit, it might become sort of an L-shaped building, like you're turning on to, say, 7th or 8th down here, okay? So as long as it meets the other traffic requirements and safety issues of an additional driveway cutout, I think we should be considering allowing a driveway cut for that L shape on the duplex.
So just so I make sure I'm understanding, because I think I know what you're saying. So because we do have some language in there that clearly says no additional driveways are to be allowed, which is kind of was already there. It just was squishy about how it was written, so we tried to clear that up. Are you saying, Gary, if we're taking a corner lot, that you'd have a driveway on one side and a driveway on the other, so they'd be on opposite streets, or on the same street?
Probably on the other streets. And let me say, if you go up, like at, say, Park Place in Keizer, those aren't that old. They're 20-year-old duplexes when that subdivision was put on. And you have a number of duplexes where both driveways
Yeah,
are,
they're
say
side
they're
by
on,
side.
they're on Park Place.
Yeah.
But if you put another unit on there, and the way to make it fit cohesively, it would then have, you'd have an L unit rather than just a straight across. You'd have an L.
Right.
Well, then on Keizer, you could potentially have a driveway, as long as it meets the other criteria in terms of safety and ingress and egress to traffic. But I think that's something we need to consider if we're really trying to increase density. And again, there's probably not, I'm just going to pull a number out of the air. There's probably not 20 properties like that in the city limits.
Sure. Well, in that specific case, they have on-street parking, so they wouldn't have to provide any new parking for the ADU.
How do you define okay, then let's go down to Churchdale.
It's not a no
No
parking zone.
Okay, but
I mean, Churchdale's public street. You can technically park on the shoulder there too. It'd be more so. The way we would implement the parking standard is legitimately if they were on a street that's truly a no parking street, or they're at the end of a street that has a no parking turnaround, or on a private access easement. So there's no available on the street parking in, near the property, basically, is what we're intending to do there. I think it's totally a policy question, and that's absolutely, I think it depends on how far you want to go. The one thing I will just say with the driveways, part of that standard lives because of our Public Works Department standards, and generally their standard is 1 driveway per lot. So when folks have multiple driveways, they have to get kind of special permission to do that, and then there's a limit of the overall driveway drop width. But that's where with duplexes, we not only allow, but require, unless otherwise required by our public works director, we actually require 2 opposite driveways on opposite streets. So I think that the idea of allowing a driveway to an ADU, I think if it was on an opposite street, because it's a corner type lot situation, I think there's already some precedent that would support that, to be perfectly honest. I think if it's all on one street, then I would want to at least make sure that with any change you propose, that we make sure to either defer, and I don't know, maybe Shannon can help me. What I don't want to do is I don't want to write text that will then put us sideways of the public works director. So
that's why I'm saying this needs to be a collaborative change. We
Yeah.
can't do this in a vacuum and have an effective change unless we coordinate it in a way that's palatable to Public Works. and serves the community. Because also by doing this, if you remove cars from the street, that's going to allow more for guest parking. And it's probably also going to keep it more in keeping with the neighborhood characteristics. It may not be as offensive as just having this L and why do these people always park out in the street and blah, you know, because you're not going to have a unit and a garage. You're going to have a driveway that goes up to the living room window, whatever it might be. I just think we can't lock these things out. So I've babbled enough.
I want to put my 2 cents in related to parking, just because of the experience we've had on traffic safety and Newburgh, and the parking on Newburgh, and the perceptions by the residents that that parking is theirs and
Public.
not, well, the type of the street is, it's like Churchdale, whatever, and it's not well-defined, you know, with a sidewalk and all that. That if they park there, that's my property, and those kind of issues. The city has been really good in trying to explain, both the police and public works, in explaining that, but anytime we say use street parking, those concerns may come up, and it's more of a, not to change this, but just, you know, okay, there's going to be some questions from a community when these kind of things come up. Matt?
If I can ask one additional point of clarity, you said moving forward, we're looking at 1 ADU per property, is that correct?
Yeah, that's how, I mean, that's actually the language has always been there for that.
Okay. And I don't know why I'm getting hung up on this particular language, but it says only one of the 2 dwelling units, where we at? Yeah,
May be
we're in-
occupied by a family, which does
Yeah,
not
yeah.
include an owner occupant of the building.
So I don't know why I'm getting hung up on that, but it feels like to me that you have the main home and then additionally possibly 2 ADUs. I don't know why I'm getting hung up on that, but
So that sub D, remember that's under the attached ADU section only. So those are standards only applying to attached ADUs.
okay, and then,
So, and then-
but it repeats the language again down
Correct.
in G on the,
Right, and then it just says only one of the 2 dwelling units may be occupied by a family to which does not include an owner occupant of the building.
right, so you see where I'm getting, because
I don't.
Because,
I'm seeing 3.
well,
I don't know why I'm seeing 3, because I'm seeing the home, right, and then the one of 2, which says,
you
Well,
say,
the
you say
home-
2 dwelling units, meaning, we're not saying there's 2 accessory dwelling units. There are 2 dwelling units. One's accessory, one's main.
okay,
So we didn't multiply the verbiage to say you have 1 accessory and 1 main, and only one of those can be, we just said of those 2, only 1 can be occupied by something other than a family member.
What if we just struck of the building at the end of that sentence? Would that read clearer for you? I kind of understand that you're,
well, okay, and this just goes, and I'm
No,
sorry,
dude,
I'm
no
sorry
worries.
for playing the moron here, right? But we've said that an ADU could have a family.
yeah,
The main home could have a family.
sure.
Together, both could have a family. This to me reads that you can't have that. It says only 1 may be occupied by a family.
That's not an owner occupant.
That's not an owner occupant.
That's not an owner, right? So,
Okay, and maybe that's the thing that I keep going, maybe that's where I'm failing, is that that the owner occupant has
We're
to be
not-
on the property,
yeah,
period, where the ADU and the regular home is.
yeah. So
I
what,
don't know
so.
why, I don't know why that's getting to me, but,
So yeah, and yeah, we never regulate families because the state defines families and it's protected, and you can't, you know, if it's, you know, up to 5 unrelated individuals living as a unit, like we can't touch it. It's federal fair housing and fair housing stuff that regulates that, right? So when we say family, we really are intending to grab that owner occupant element. I'm not opposed to changing the language if you think something would make it more clear.
I think I'm the only one having the problem with it, so it's probably just me.
No, I initially had that concern. The only thing that I would think about would be, how would I rephrase that? Just go ahead. Shannon.
This doesn't gosh, I'm gonna turn this stupid thing off. Sorry. This doesn't address the possible duplex issue that Gary brought up, so we'd have to tweak it there, because I hadn't thought that that would be physically possible, frankly, but I think you're probably right. You could just totally rewrite it to just read the owner of the property must reside in either the principal residence or the ADU.
Yes, that's,
But when you have a duplex,
That's
is
the
the
problem.
principal property
Well,
where if, say, Mark had a duplex, and he lived in one half of that duplex, the principal owner's there, but the other unit and an ADU would still be, but in the language that's there,
so I just changed it to a principal residence. So the owner of the property must reside in either a principal residence or the ADU. I don't know if that takes care of the duplex issue or not.
We have to do some other language changes to allow it in addition to a duplex anyway. And we need to look at some definitions, because when we get into multifamily in a definition in our code, then we get into anything that's 3 or more units. So that's where, by definition, some things start going a little different, which we really, like,
Yeah.
I would, if you guys want to go that way, which is totally fine, I would ask that maybe you give us the ability to come back to you with a proposal along those lines, because
We have
generally
multifamily issues.
single family and duplex, so 1 and 2 family, and it's actually not even single family and duplex, it's 1 and 2 family dwellings are generally defined and regulated not only in our development code, but also in the state building code a certain way. 3 and more units are regulated a different way. Now, again, Gary, I think in your situation, I don't think it would be a huge deal, and but I do think we need to tweak some things. Oh, I'm getting a yeah, but.
Our experience is, as far as a detached ADU, I honestly do not believe there is a case out there where that could physically happen. For the last 15 years, when we have seen duplexes on corner lots, they have been minimal as far as property. And there is, I cannot believe that you would be able to meet your separation, your dwelling separation requirements and all of your other setback requirements and physically be located. Now, whether it's an interior ADU, that I can't speak to off the top of my head. But again, when you start having 3 units on one lot, you change the entire category, and there are some really, there would have to be a lot of in-depth structural changes to the code.
well, but I think while we're discussing this, because we don't have to reach a conclusion tonight, I don't believe, I think that there are reasons to explore this a little bit further if one of the goals of this process is to increase available housing on our existing land, which I think this is part of what's driving that. Isn't that true? True. Okay. So,
It definitely is what drove the bill.
Mark, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, Chair. One of the first things I wanted to say is I really appreciate Shane taking the time Monday to answer a number of questions I came in to talk to him about. I've always found it helpful to chat with staff before these meetings to educate myself, and I thought I got most of it done, but a couple things that you didn't mention that I have questions for, that we talked about. The 750 square feet, I have no problem putting a limit on it. I'm not exactly sure. My question is this, is if, because a lot of this is hypothetical, and somebody has an 800 square foot structure previously allowed accessory building prior to the 98 amendments, I believe it was. They could apply for a variance rather than trying to have 50 feet of that building become still an accessory building, not accessible by the 750. See what I'm saying? You got 800 square feet. I'm not talking about someone with 1,500 square feet trying to get 1,500. I'm talking about somebody with 750 or 800, 900, 850.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think,
They meet the other setbacks and the other things.
yeah, I mean, a variance can be, like, in no way, shape, or form can I indicate whether or not we would recommend approval on that variance without
Absolutely.
going through the public process.
Well, yeah, and there's
But-
too many other
Right.
questions about
But
that
yes,
variance.
Mark, that is, and I forgot that we did talk about that. Yes, the variance process, there's nothing in the language that preclude the ability for somebody to apply for a variance to any of our standards, and any standard that's a quantifiable standard can theoretically have a variance be requested on it. So something very minor like that, if somebody said, hey, it seems really dumb to do this or that or the other thing, so could I apply for the minor variance, go through that process, give a good argument, and go through that? We absolutely could process a request for an application like that.
And don't forget, the second part, you said, assuming they meet all the other setbacks. But what we're saying is those legally established accessory structures that are converted, they don't, we would make that allowance that they do not have to change those. Let's say they don't have, they were 3 feet or whatever.
Okay.
They would still be allowed because we would
convert.
not make them reconfigure the existing structure.
But they'd have to have the design standards, for example.
They'd have-
Accessory building that's
Sure.
a tin shed or something, or well, whatever. The other thing that just thought of was, and Gary kind of prompted when you start talking about the duplexes, was we talk about the conversion of these accessory buildings or the creation of these ADUs. And it doesn't happen a lot in Keizer, but I was amazed in the last few days when I was driving around kind of thinking of this ADU stuff, the number of buildings there are on the very few alleys that we have. I live in the Gupser area, and there's a lot, I didn't realize the number of accessory buildings that are in the alleys of that neighborhood that could be ADUs. So when we start talking about, we're talking about from I was thinking the front street, but access to most of these would be off the alley. So are we missing something? Am I missing something? I mean,
Not on purpose. So we do have, I mean, in the language under F, where we talk about setbacks and height, there is a provision in there that basically says, unless it's located on an alley, in which case the setback shall be 1 foot. You make a valid point, Mark, in that when does an alley become a street versus being an alley? And I guess ultimately,
well, these were definitely alleys, but,
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah, so I mean,
So the alley would be legal access. You would have the question of the parking requirement,
Well, and the access door,
then the
does
access
it have to
door.
face the alley or, I mean, I don't know.
By our definition, we wouldn't count that as the front of the property. We would count that as the rear, even if
Okay.
it is an alley.
All right.
So they wouldn't have to face the front, they wouldn't have to face the alley.
But the parking would be an issue.
But the parking, they would have to provide a parking stall.
Could still be
Wait,
parking on the street.
not if
I-
there was on-street
Correct.
parking.
Not if there's on-street parking on Main Street.
Yes, right, sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
And the other comment I wanted to make was, Christy and I have a daughter who lives in San Diego, and I believe it is the capital of ADUs. Because I don't know, in my particular daughter's neighborhood, South Park, I don't think there is a structure in their neighborhood that doesn't have at least one ADU. And
Wow.
and there are apartments there too, but every garage has been turned into an ADU, and some houses that had 2 stories are been turned into a 4-plex, and I mean, it's crazy stuff, but most of them probably not permitted, I'm assuming. And the comment I'm making, not to say that we're heading down this path, but one of my concerns always is parking, and parking is horrible because of the number of ADUs there. And yes, we do not own the parking in front of our house, I realize that, and that's fine, but it is a part of our environment and a part of our culture. And it's gonna be changed. And so, although I think it's fine not to require a ADU, because I think we're really limiting these, the way we're doing it. I don't think I think it's fine not to require parking, off-street parking for them, if there's adequate on-street parking. I'm just saying it's a change. And you start attacking people's cars and their parking spots.
That's what I was mentioning
Oh,
earlier.
next thing you're
Frank.
just start talking about their dogs and cats. Okay, anyway.
Crystal?
I have a couple questions. First one, Gary kind of briefly touched on this, but I was wondering what the drivers were for the recent influx of questioning about ADUs and where this is coming from.
I mean, obviously, it would be just speculation on my part, but I think a huge part was this was in the state legislature, and they passed new laws at the first of the year that went into effect July 1st. So basically, it required any city over 2,500 people, population-wise, that we would have to allow for ADUs, because a lot of places didn't allow them. Now, we, Keizer, as a whole, we were like super progressive, because when the law got kind of when it started getting talked about, I started getting calls from other jurisdictions around the state asking for, oh, do you guys have this? Oh yeah, we've allowed it since 1998. Well, do you have all these problems with it? I was like, no, I think in 20 years of working here, I've processed like 3 building permits for ADUs. Like it's very uncommon that we've had any, but I think, Salem did a pretty robust public involvement process where they went out and kind of had a bunch of meetings, decided what they were going to do, and they have one of their pages on their website is devoted to ADUs and how to create an accessory dwelling unit. And so I think that's probably what's driven a lot of the conversations. And then the other piece is, we're, what did it say? Over 25% of our population is considered highly rent burdened. So, we have, in Keizer, we have high rents for what we are making money-wise, and which, good news for us, we get money from the state to do a new housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory out of it, which is great. But bad for the folks living here in that some of us struggle to make the bills get paid. And so I think ADUs have also represented in a lot of folks' mindsets, hey, I've got my individual house and I can put an ADU in the backyard and it can be a little bit of a rental income and help me cover my bills and share utilities and all of those things. And Mark alluded to it in San Diego. My sister lives in Altadena and down in Southern California. You spend any time in New York City and any other truly urban metropolitan area, you've got, apartments that are subleased. And it's just because of the overall market pressure on how much things cost. And so I think that's what a lot we're seeing now is as our market has grown and grown in costs, it's harder and harder for folks. So here's an option that creates some flexibility and creates some opportunity. And so it's becoming more popular.
Thank you. That's what I was wondering as well. So that leads to my next question of why the owner needs to be on the property. Could it just be full rentals? Could we have 2 or 3 just rentals that the person doesn't
Yeah,
live
so right now the language that we proposed isn't proposing to do that, but clearly it is a policy question for you folks to consider and for council to consider. I'll defer to Nate and let him talk about this one a little bit. I felt like he talks smarter than me, so I'm going to let him talk about this one.
So basically it boils down to neighborhood character. And I think all of us have had the experience of when you go to a neighborhood that is all rentals, it affects the neighborhood character. And though, generalizations are never accurate 100% of the time, but generally owner occupied has more commitment to a local community, a neighborhood, more of a presence as to the kind of character that the neighborhood has. And so if we were just simply to say, you can have 2 units on every home, on every lot, and they can both be rental units, my concern and the city's concern for many years now has been to try to preserve some neighborhood character and some neighborhood ownership. So that's basically where that comes to. So it is a policy, a pure policy question. The state is urging us not to have an ownership requirement, And they of course make the argument that there is, how do you enforce this? And we acknowledge that is a problem. But if there is a problem in the future, then there is at least a tool to be able to address it with. So,
2 more questions.
Okay.
Is there any consideration or worry in the future for like VRBOs and Airbnbs that might bring a lot of temporary residents
Right.
that rent out the area?
Yeah, so that's actually something that we did bring up and talk a bit as a staff about. So, for example, in Salem, they actually straight up prohibit an ADU being used as a short-term rental property. But they also went through and passed an ordinance. They collect TOT tax money. They went through a whole big process. Actually, my buddy David is a finance guy over there, and so as he was going through the process a year and a half ago, well, it was kind of before the eclipse is when it was. That's kind of, I think, what drove it. But anyway, he was talking to me quite a bit about that. And we have talked as a staff here a few times at the city as to whether or not we want to get more in depth with regulating VRBOs or short-term rentals. And at this point in time, it's difficult. In our department lives also the code enforcement world for the city of Keizer. And we have one guy for a town of like 38,000 people, and he's, super thinly spread. And if you have a program that's regulating short-term rentals and multifamily housing and all of those things, we're all for it, but we can't do it with the staffing level or resource allocation that we currently have. So there would have to be some kind of bigger policy decisions made, which is why this language doesn't specifically delve into the short-term rental discussion. It's silent on it on purpose. It was actually in the little list of questions I kind of had given out to our staff as we kind of roundtabled to talk about the changes. I said, is this something that we want to crack that thing open and really tackle it? We haven't seen a ton of VRBOs and Airbnbs and short-term rentals in Keizer. So it hasn't really been something that has gotten a lot of traction here, at least not as of this time. But Crystal, you're absolutely right. If we wanted to regulate those in a way or limit them and say they couldn't be used for short-term rental, we could add language to that. Like I said, Salem specifically does have language in their standard that says it can't be used for short-term rental, and I think they define that as anything under 30 days. So anybody living in an ADU on a property, as an ADU, they'd have to be there at least, 30 days, so month-to-month rental kind of deal. So we could definitely add language in like that if we wanted to. I don't think we have really a mechanism to regulate it right now, however.
That's fair, and I think my thought process is just if we are trying to maintain the character of the neighborhoods and we don't want to have so many rentals, then that would be a similar vein of thought that we also wouldn't want temporary rentals if that's where we want to go, or if we just want to let people do whatever they want with their properties and make as much money as they can. Airbnbs can be quite profitable. I just wondered what the thought process was. And then my last question is, does the parking need to be paved? Or can it be gravel or dirt? Does it need to be a paved parking?
So, currently it would. To count as a true on-site parking space, it would need to be a hard, durable, dust-free surface built according to Public Works standards is kind of the language in the parking section. So it would technically need to be paved, asphalt, pavers, something like that. Like the main parking for the house. Now you can do additional parking as an option for an RV pad, things like that behind the front yard, so side or rear yard, that could just be graveled.
Okay.
And follow-up question, I'll anticipate it from Matt because I see him thinking, what about the old neighborhood that has the old pre-existing driveway that's gravel, like the first home I owned on Shady Lane? Generally, the way we would apply that standard is if that driveway was already there and wide enough to accommodate a car, we would allow it to stay with that same material under the pre-existing non-conforming use section of the code. But that is it gets into really case by case. So I can't give a totally across the board answer.
Okay. All right.
Did he anticipate you?
I didn't get
No,
Matt's question.
I mean, it's a
Still
good
got one.
question.
I thought I knew what his question was because I had the same one.
So, Mr. Chair, if I can, so the duplex piece is carved out sort of as on its own, right? I think for your traditional single-family home, adding an ADU, I'm a huge proponent of trying to keep that neighborhood continuity there. But in the case of duplexes, most often people don't live in duplexes; they rent them out. And is there an I hate to sort of create two standards, right? But is there an opportunity to do that so that a property owner could rent both units and have the ADU?
I mean, I think yes. Could, yes. I'm a little bit uncomfortable to kind of try to think that through at the table while I sit here when I haven't really wrapped my mind around. I haven't wrapped my mind around that one a little bit, but yes, I think clearly. So right now, the parent section of 2.403 is shared housing facilities. And in our development code, the reason I'm only bringing you two sections is because that term shared housing facilities already existed in all of our residential zones. If we described it down into the specifics of what used to be two-family shared housing, which we're now saying is attached ADUs, or detached ADUs, which used to be called accessory residential housing, or duplexes on a corner lot, they're technically three subcategories of shared housing facilities. So those three distinct areas, the duplex on a corner lot, the attached ADU, the detached ADU, are all allowed in the same places currently in our code. Otherwise, honestly, if it wasn't already listed that way and I didn't want to have to bring 15 sections of the development code to change one word, I would have probably proposed to say, you know what, let's just say ADU and duplex. They're two different things, right? But they already live in the same code section. So I think when we go back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier, Matt, and that's where our code gets pretty specific when you talk about 2 dwellings versus 3 and 4 and more is multifamily. That's kind of the tipping point. So I do think what we would need to do is if we were going to allow an ADU on a lot that already had a duplex, we really would probably need to rewrite this section a little more and restructure it so it made sense.
Well, in addition to allowing for the property owner not to live on that site, I think that it would
yes.
significantly increase the opportunity for
Yes.
ADUs on those kinds of properties. Right now, as I'm reading and understanding it, it would be precluded from happening, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And that is, clearly we have the occupancy requirement, the one that always lived there, the new one that brought it in to clarify it being there.
Right.
If you guys proposed to say, hey, we want to lift and get rid of that occupancy requirement, that makes it a little easier on the duplex question on allowing an ADU. But then we just have to be a little careful about how I'd have to kind of analyze the definitions and make sure we could get there. Because I think building code, if you did an attached ADU to a duplex and you end up with 3 units in one building, it's straight up multifamily commercial building code.
Right.
So it gets kind of weird. So anyway.
Gary?
I think Shannon is.
The ADU, I'm a strong proponent of an owner of the property occupancy requirement. I don't care which property they live in, but I think there's value in maintaining character and yada, yada, yada by having an owner occupant in one of those 2 or 3, if we include duplexes on corner lots, that there should be an owner occupancy requirement. But I also think, again, that it's worth looking at what language needs to be changed, adopted, or just left alone to allow that, even though it's a rare instance, where you can increase housing in our city without expanding urban growth boundaries. And if you can do, even if it's, a minimal amount, we're still not cannibalizing more land by allowing an ADU on a duplex, whether it be attached or detached, as long as they meet the same setback, siting, parking,
Sure.
design, all that stuff, I think it's worth discussion. Whether it ends up in one additional housing unit or 50 additional housing units, it could benefit our community.
Sure. And I mean,
I agree.
one thing I would kind of maybe point you guys to take a look at, and I mean, I guess it just depends on if we end up getting to a recommendation tonight or we don't, but if we didn't get to a recommendation tonight and it was one of those things that we table to discuss it further, I think one of the ways you could get there, Gary, is looking at that model code language that would allow both an attached and a detached ADU at a max, because that's kind of what the state, that was one of the things the state recommended, that cities strongly consider allowing up to 2. So you could have one that was attached and one that was detached. So that might be a way that we would look at it if you still wanted to have the owner occupancy requirement. And I think what it would take, though, language-wise, which we talked about this before, and ultimately we landed on part of the owner occupancy argument that Nate had made, is that helps us differentiate between what is an attached ADU versus what is a duplex. Because an attached ADU is allowed on any residential lot. It's not a corner lot of 7,000 square feet. It's any residential lot. So that was part of the differentiation is, well, we know duplexes are on corner lots of 7,000 square feet, and we know ADUs, they could be, but they don't have to be. But what they do have to be is owner occupied. So I think we would need to massage that language to get a little more clarity of what's a duplex versus an attached ADU, and then kind of marry that to make sense with, I mean, obviously it just depends on what you folks want to do as far as recommendation goes.
Nate, go ahead.
So the owner occupancy is a hurdle. That is an obstacle. And you need to understand that part of my perspective, and the reason you can tell that this was important to me, is because of the mileage that we have in some of the neighborhood discussions in simple things such as a partition of a large lot into 3 additional units. We have had neighborhoods, I have had city councilors express concerns that we are not paying attention. We are changing the core neighborhood structure, that we are impacting these neighborhoods significantly. And so when I say this is an important issue, it's an important issue depending on your perspective. If your perspective, Gary, is to try to figure out how we're going to get additional dwelling units in our city, then I think we need to think very carefully about these obstacles that we are putting in with it. So it's like a spectrum. It's like a scale of how much impact do we want to introduce into this community. Because whether or not it becomes an immediate hot topic, I will guarantee you that there will be concerns raised if we start introducing significant changes into established neighborhoods. So that's...
And the ADUs are going to do that because potentially, if we've got, say, 5,000 homes now that have the foot space to do that, now you've got 10,000 homes there. Mm-hmm. So that's going to impact the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. But if you increase a single family house by 1, that's a 50% increase. If you do this on the probably very rare, you're only increasing it by 33%. So, you're increasing it in a less impactful way.
Well, and the thing that I constantly wrestle with, because I'm getting old now, is the world is changing and people's perspectives are changing. And so do we need to recognize that change? Do we need to be a little more flexible than that conservative, well, that's the way I got beat up about this thing 5 years ago. Those are things that I think you as the commission need to wrestle with and need to give some careful thought to as to this threshold of change. We know the world is changing. We know that we are in a, quote, housing crisis. in that cost of housing and is creating all kinds of different structural layers in our culture. So these are significant policy questions that we're asking you to wrestle with and to assert.
Shannon.
Thanks. By the way, my apologies for being late. Got caught up in traffic in Salem coming back. So.
darn.
I had to run an errand down there. So a couple of things. One, I assume while I was absent, you opened the public hearing,
Yes.
correct? Okay. What? And again, I don't want to, I mean, however you guys want to discuss this is fine. You can deal with it as any way the chair of the commission wants to do with it. Sounds to me like two of the questions, and maybe a third, is the duplex issue, the ownership issue, and possibly the parking, although I think everybody understands the parking, so that may not be all that big an issue to you folks. I wanted to remind you, I think you all understand this, but the parking requirement, it isn't, you can put in that parking if you want. In other words, so your question, Gary, except for the issue of the driveways, you can, even if it's not required, you can add it if you want, subject to public works standards. And the way that standard reads, just so everybody understands, is the idea of trying to avoid an additional curb cut. So if it is required, and I think it will be rare, because it's only in situations where there's no parking at all, doesn't matter about the shoulder. In that rare situation, you have to widen the driveway instead of making another cut. So I think everybody understood that part. With regard to the ownership issue, DLCD did recommend not getting into that for the two reasons, I think, as you saw in the standards. One is an issue of is that a barrier? Because you're going to have, okay, an investor who says, oh, if I can't rent them both out, I'm not going to build the ADU, so there's less chance of being built. But also just the enforcement issue. So, and Nate is right, it's purely a policy question for you folks. One issue that I thought was kind of interesting, of course, is duplex. The owner doesn't have to live in one half of a duplex. So, you know, there's that issue. My suggestion to you, because there may be, you may want to direct staff to come back with something, or you may want to be done, depending on what you decide. In terms of process, if you, just as a suggestion, you might want to take up the duplex issue first without closing the hearing as a preliminary matter, and also maybe the ownership issue, just generally, as conceptually, to see where you folks land. And the reason I say that is if it and I would agree with Nate and Shane both, and that doesn't mean not to do it as a policy matter, but the duplex issue becomes a little bigger nut to crack. And we definitely would want to, I think, come back to you if that's the direction you want to go as to allowing an ADU on a duplex lot. So that's why I suggest not closing the hearing and discussing at least those two issues or any other issues you want, and then we can determine whether it's something we need to come back to, because what I don't want to do is close the hearing and come back next meeting and then somebody wants to testify. That's the reasoning.
Commissioners?
I think that's
Yeah,
reasonable
but
advice.
I do have to speak on Nate's comments about ownership in the community. And I'm not going to be on the committee. This is my swan song tonight. But I want to, as a long-term Keizer resident, Grandpa bought property here in 1926, and I've lived here since '59. Yes, there's change, and we have to, you know, I got gray hair too, and see changes here, and where a grocery store used to be, and all that. But the real basic feelings, I concur with Nate, that if we can have the ownership within our communities, I'm still for that, having an owner. Just because of the nature of Keizer, what I've heard while I was on this committee, on other committees, and just being a long-term resident. So I think you're talking about the core of Keizer, the feelings of Keizer. So I appreciate that. So with that, we're not going to do a recommendation, but to direct staff to come back to talk to us more about the duplexes, the ownership, and
Excuse me. What I was suggesting is that either by consensus or by a preliminary vote, you let us know about the duplex issue. So if the majority of the commission wants to allow an ADU on a duplex lot, I think that's true, but I'm not positive because I can't quite count there.
Even if they just have questions.
Or if you want, have and that's fine. So if you want to come back next meeting regardless, then that would be the issue. But we do sort of need direction on the one in terms of drafting with regard to the duplex issue. Otherwise, we're not going to know what to bring back.
Let me, go ahead,
go ahead.
sorry.
I was just gonna try to move this along. Mr. Chair, I don't have any problem whatsoever with the ownership requirement. And I will have to tell you, I like things simple. It helps me. And so when it says dwelling units, and the building must contain not more than 2 dwelling units, and there must not be more than 2 dwelling units per lot, I find that very simple, very understandable, and that's what I support.
I'm in support of the ownership thing overall for both regular single-family homes as well as duplexes as well.
I'm
Additional dwelling unit on a duplex?
I think if it makes sense, I mean,
Meets the other criteria in terms of
Yeah.
siting, parking?
absolutely. I mean, so being of the younger generation up here on the dais, a lot of what we're hearing is people, even quite a bit younger than me, aren't wanting big, 16, 1700 square foot homes. They want to come back and live with mom and dad and be boomerang kids and stuff. And I think opportunities for ADUs would be that perfect scenario, which fits very into the ownership piece and then the style, and it just kind of maintains that same feel. And being in a housing bubble or crisis as we are, I think that would certainly allow that opportunity, both with ADUs for duplexes, whether it's attached or detached, or single-family home lots.
I may be the only one that's doesn't agree, but I do agree that I agree with ADUs, but I don't agree with the ownership portion of it, only because of what you were saying. In the younger generation are becoming boomerang generations, and I know quite a few of my friends that live in their parents' homes. Their parents don't live there, and they want to rent out rooms or basements or potentially an ADU. And so I personally don't agree with the ownership piece of it.
With regard to the duplex question?
In general, the ownership. The duplex question I'm good with. I agree with that.
Good with what?
The ADUs on duplexes.
So to move things ahead, I don't see where we can make a recommendation completely tonight.
I think you've got a majority.
I think so,
Make a
right there.
recommendation to
Okay,
change
we,
language.
it's so hard to count to 3, Mark. I mean, it's really hard on nights when there's all 7 of you here, so.
So
We,
all,
Perhaps unintended.
so can we all agree to make a recommendation on the duplex issue?
I believe so. I can.
I can agree that you make a recommendation.
You don't agree with the recommendation?
we'll wrestle with that duplex issue to see, it may be
let me,
tricky.
let me see if I can characterize what you would be asking us to do, is to come back to you with an analysis of all of the issues that would have to be addressed and the potential areas of the code that would have to be modified or addressed to be able to allow those 3 units on one lot as an
would
accessory
include
dwelling with a duplex.
Public works issues too, right?
Okay, and throwing in the public works issues too. I don't anticipate that's going to be insurmountable, but yes, the public works issues too. Thank you for that.
Just so I kind of have a record there, in terms of the ownership issue, other than Crystal, did any of you others have any concern on that?
Well,
The reason I ask is for purposes of just drafting. We can come back and
Yeah.
change it either way.
So
You're not
it
making
sounds
a
like
lifetime
four of us.
commitment.
No,
No,
I just want to know for drafting purposes because I wasn't sure. Okay,
I definitely am
all
for
right.
the ownership.
that's fine.
I'm in favor of the ownership.
Yeah.
And occupying one of
Yeah,
the units on the property.
Yes.
Okay, so because I spent a lot of time in the code and the model code looking at different things, and we brought a certain recommendation to you with your concept of an ADU with a duplex. For those of you that are supportive of that, as I'm going to go back and I'm going to try to draft some language to put before you at the next meeting so it can be considered, is there a difference in your mind whether or not that's a duplex or it's a single family home that has an interior dwelling unit, like if there was a conversion? So I guess my point is that
Oh,
do you only want to allow a detached ADU on a duplex corner lot, or are you willing to allow that detached ADU where you'd have an attached ADU and a detached ADU?
my goodness.
What about triplexes?
Well, we're not talking about triplexes, they're in a different zone, they're handled differently. And
Yeah.
that's-
It is
but
true.
that's where we kind of run over.
Then it truly
wanting
would be
to-
multifamily at that point, Gary, and we wouldn't care if it was an ADU because we just call them all dwellings, and you can have any number of buildings with any number of dwelling units.
so to just restate, not all, but the main part, I think of what Shane's getting at, if you have a house, it's a good size house with a good size yard, could they convert the interior to make one attached ADU, it's not on a corner lot, and a separate detached in the backyard?
In other words,
You end up with 3 units,
the
but not on a corner lot.
Correct, but it could be anywhere theoretically. You'd still have the same
Long as there's-
provisions. The reason I'm asking is one of selfishness, because I have some model code language that speaks to that already, which is where you would allow both an attached and a detached dwelling unit. So I think there's kind of a pathway forward in that route with just defining the difference between a duplex. But I really just wanted to hear if there was a difference in your opinion of support, if it's only on these corner lot pieces, or anyway, yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to get at.
Mark?
Well, I guess if we're, in light of what you're talking about, and if we're gonna allow the one, like, for example, the duplex, then I think we should allow
Yeah.
the other. And quite frankly, I'm more in favor of that than I would be in favor of the duplex. I'm not exactly sure why, but it just seems that we should treat them equally.
we still have some research, you may have model language, but we still have our other code that you're going to have to analyze for those 3 units, and does that cross the threshold, et cetera, et cetera. So,
I think all properties should be treated equally, whether that be an interior and an ADU.
So basically,
Okay.
what this means is the state model code suggestion is what we are now considering to allow basically up to 3 units on one property. 1 as an interior, 1 as a detached, and the main structure. That's what we're going
And
to
the
be coming
only-
back to you with
And
an
the only
analysis.
caveat that we as Keizerites are suggesting is the ownership.
Okay.
Okay. The public hearing, well, just give us a second. The public hearing will continue, will be carried over, so we're not closing it
And
tonight.
that would be to the November
14, it looks like.
14.
Get into the little.
November 14. Mark your calendars,
Calendars.
folks.
I don't mark in mine.
Well, you have to be here, you don't have a replacement yet.
Yes, they do.
Does.
Yes, they do.
Has it been approved by the council? No?
Monday night.
Maybe.
Gary,
Ooh,
Okay, council liaison.
Let's see. Well, we have openings on committees. I found it on the website tonight. So I'm just tickled because normally I always have such a challenge finding it on the website. Points of interest. We have one opening, sorry. Public Arts Commission, we have 2 openings. Parks Board, there are 2 openings. Traffic, bikeways, pedestrian, there is 1 opening, and we're always recruiting for youth liaisons. Let me switch pages here, and I'm going to go to our report. Let me go one more. Oh, I knew I was going to do that. Sorry, kicked me out. The Dearborn Bridge is about done. I think open house is next week, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday with a date attached to it, because there's always a next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday.
Gary. That's the 16th, correct? Yes. Sorry, I was getting to my. Looks like they completed the hydro seeding at Meadows Park. The drinking fountain was removed and replaced too. So making that park look really, really nice. If you've not been out there, I would suggest taking a visit to that and to see all the new play structure equipment. And an Eagle Scout completed the replacing of the horseshoe pits at Bob Newton Park. Mark already alluded to this, that he spent the day out at Keizer River Rapids Park installing irrigation system for the arboretum, so all the trees will not have to be hand watered, so.
Because you should always plant trees, have a drought, then install irrigation.
Never do it backwards.
And if you've not been out to the park to actually look at the trees, I would encourage everyone to do that as well.
And we're planting 8 more on November 3rd.
That's a great day, by the way.
Good council work day, council community work day, wouldn't it?
That I was what? That I'm going to be there? Yeah. I think that's really it from the city. I will say this is not a city event, but tomorrow night is the candidate forum, and it's sponsored by the Keizer Chamber. It's here at 6 o'clock. And then also tomorrow night at 7:30, so there's a time change for the West Keizer Neighborhood Association meeting is at 7:30 versus 7. Gary?
Councilor Freeman, the candidate forum, is that for those running for Keizer City Council, or is it also county commissioners?
No,
or is
just
it-
the Keizer City Council
Okay, thank
positions,
you.
yes. So they're taking questions from the audience. And they'll be read by 2 other people. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Debbie?
You all have one of these in front of you. This is what Councilor Freeman just told you about. I have more. If you are going out to dinner and you want to spread them around the restaurant you're in, or if you are going to a meeting or you have friends that might be interested, please give these out. I'm recruiting. We need volunteers. And the other thing is, this was in your packet. The Keizer Chamber Foundation is doing a program like they did last year. They've assured me it's a different program, but it's called the same thing, Building Better Boards, a leadership series. It is October 18th, I think, or is it the 16th? 18th, okay, 16th, or the 18th, and I will pass this out. It comes with a meal, light meal, and everybody on Keizer boards are invited, and they are free. So you can fill out your name and information, and I will turn that into the Chamber Foundation.
I attended the one last year. It was focused a little more on nonprofit boards, but there was still really good information there, so.
So we're not in ethics violation if we go to this, right? Since they're providing a free meal, we're not in ethics violation for gifts? Okay. I'm just making sure.
No. Council Representative Michael DeBlasi is
On travel.
he's traveling?
Yeah, I think he went East Coast for at least this week.
I would think that since the hearing was continued, that we would postpone that report
Okay.
until we actually have something to report.
Something to report. That makes very good sense. So just
Okay.
put Michael on hold for the next time.
Just make Hirsch do it one more time. So this is it, Hirsch, huh?
this is it. Before I do the gavel, I've had 2 terms on this committee, and it's been one of those committees where you really had to read a lot and a lot of discussions. And one thing that I really, really have to admire is that we disagreed on things to, I disagree with you. But it's always been respectful, and we've moved on to other issues without bringing old baggage along. And I think that's, for 2 terms on commission, I've gotten to work with a lot of different people, and I'm impressed and I'm proud. And I love our staff. I really do. I think other cities would be extremely jealous of what kind of staff we have here in Keizer and the kind of people they are. So thank you very much. And as always, go Beavs. Adjourned.
Thank you, Hirsch.
Thanks, Herb.